Hello everybody, and thank you for tuning in to this UNGA side event on climate adaptation, which is an initiative of the Dutch government together with the Global Centre on Adaptation. My name is Ikenna Azwike, and it is my pleasure to be your host today. Now, a mere 8 months ago, the Netherlands organized a summit dedicated entirely to adaptation, the Climate Adaptation Summit 2021. So why are we still here talking about adaptation? Because there is still a long way to go. We need to achieve the climate goals set for 2030, and we're going to do that today with a packed program of speakers and various experts. Today we're going to look at how the commitments launched 8 months ago have fared. What have nations learned? And we're going to try and answer those questions with a focus on 3 main areas. The first is understanding the risks. Secondly, planning and implementation. And thirdly, the all-important theme, scaling. How are we going to do that? As you might expect, we would love you to be able to find the material that is going to be discussed today. So when you're looking back on social media, please just search for the hashtag #AdaptNow. All right, before I introduce our first speaker, let's take a look back at what was a seminal moment for adaptation, the Climate Adaptation Summit 2021.
The human being is the smartest and more ingenious creature living on planet Earth. And yet, it's the only one capable of destroying its own planet.
If we don't adapt, the consequences will be disastrous.
We need the voices of young people.
We are also the ones that are going to face this crisis, for the rest of our lives probably.
This is the battle of our lifetime.
Significantly more money and funding is needed.
And use this summit as a turning point to create a more prosperous, greener and fairer world.
So the task ahead is vast. We will need to shift the immense power of the market away from destruction and towards sustainability.
The future is now.
Tackle this great challenge of climate change, we need all hands on deck.
The leaders today have the power to shape a better future for our planet.
我们生活在同一个地球村。
Il en va de notre responsabilité à tous et de notre responsabilité à chacun.
2021 be the year that we fight back.
Certainly collaboration is a key part of this.
President Biden has made fighting climate change a top priority of his administration.
Many world leaders with such powerful commitments. I can only be very happy with that.
We need to start building a better future now.
The future is now.
Now, that was an energizing video look back at the Climate Adaptation Summit there. And to keep the same energy, I have now at the table with me perhaps the most energetic man in the Netherlands, maybe even the world, when it comes to talking about water. I know this, I've experienced it firsthand. The Dutch water envoy, Henk Ovink. Henk, welcome.
Thanks, Ikenna. Very good to be with you here. Yeah.
Henk, the Climate Adaptation Summit and COP26, which has adaptation as one of its focuses, are obviously great at keeping the momentum going for adaptation, but are we going fast enough?
No, we're not going fast enough. I think the Climate Adaptation Summit was a real momentum, first summit on adaptation ever. Has to be used as a springboard for the action, but we're not even close. We see climate change impacts across the world, even in the Netherlands. Belgium and Germany. Floods this summer showcase that climate change is here and now, and that it is not a global south problem, it is a problem of all. So the summit set the stage for our collective action, and we've seen that collective actions emerge around the world in any region, but we have to accelerate. We have to accelerate through better understanding. We have to accelerate through commitments at every level, global, national, and local. And we have to accelerate through implementation to action. And action means capacity building, action means implementation, but action also means scaling up the innovations we need.
Okay, so in concrete terms though, you mentioned some focuses there, but what would be your top 2 priorities when it comes to making climate adaptation part of the new normal?
Well, the challenge with adaptation is it's different everywhere. It's context specific. In every region around the world, we have to act differently. So no one size fits all. And that means that we have to build that awareness and ownership at every level, across all stakeholders, across all silos and vested interests. So accelerating adaptation means a complex set of actions at all these levels. And so we have to work with everybody around the world to make that change deliver. And that demands that's not a quick fix. It's not a medication you can swallow and then all of a sudden you're climate adaptive. This is a very consistent, committed approach that we have to do continuously.
Yeah.
The second thing, so it's different and we have to keep up that pace. The second is that it's about implementation. And there comes a challenge because we see great innovative projects around the world being implemented. But if you add them up, in the context of investments, it's not even a percentage. So we need to bring those implementation actions to scale. And that means replication, building pipelines, new validation and evaluation methodologies in the context of climate adaptation so we can do the better projects more, bigger, scale, and replicate them across the world.
Okay, very clear, and we'll be elaborating on what's needed later on during our panel discussion. For now, another one of the initiators of this event, and of course CAS 2021, is the Global Center on Adaptation. Its CEO, Patrick Verkooyen, is unfortunately not able to be with us live at the table right now, but I did get the chance to speak to him earlier today. Welcome, Mr. Verkooyen. Thank you very much for joining us. You are, of course, the CEO of the Global Center on Adaptation, Mr. Adaptation himself. The Climate Adaptation Summit, which you co-initiated, was 8 months ago. Tell me, what has happened since then?
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be here. I think since January last year, lots have happened. 3 things. 1, I think it's the realization globally we're all now living in the eye of the storm. We have seen the floods and the fires in the United States. We have seen the forest fires in the southern parts of Europe. We even have here in the Netherlands and in Belgium and Germany, we've been exposed to massive floods over the summer, similar to China, similar to Africa. So we're all living on the front lines, and I think it's now also front and center of society that the climate emergency has arrived. 1. Secondly, recently, the IPCC, the International Governmental Body on Climate Change, has issued its so-called 6th assessment report. What did it say? Well, in fact, we are now already living the climate emergency. The world has warmed up 1.1 degrees on average, and we're locked into a 1.5 warming degree world. That's in fact what we also committed to in Paris, to stay below 1.5 degrees. So we're already in that reality in this particular decade. And thirdly, very recently, the United Nations has done a synthesis about the commitments of governments. How are they reducing their carbon footprint? How far are we just increasing our ambition? Conclusion, not far enough. We're warming up now to a 2.6 degrees warming world if we were to implement the national plans which are currently on the table. So in summary, we're way off track to where we're supposed to be. And it also, for me, is the realization we have to fight the climate battle now on 2 fronts. We need to lower our carbon footprint, but at the same time, we need to put adaptation on par with mitigation. This is the time and struggle which we're all living in. And I think that's also very important for Glasgow to take forward.
Yeah. Well, you said it there yourself. Adaptation is definitely a hot topic. Does that mean it's plain sailing for you and the Global Center on Adaptation to get initiatives financed and so on? Or are there still challenges that you face?
Well, yes and no. Very recently, we convened 50 world leaders here in the Netherlands, in Rotterdam, And what did we do? We opened up our floating office. Our headquarters is now in as a floating office, the largest floating building in the world. That's in and of itself an innovation and sort of human ingenuity and a very good demonstration of adaptation action. But what did these leaders say? They said, again, three things. One, we need to increase ambition. Governments, private sector, cities, civil society, we need to increase our ambition on adaptation action, one. Secondly, we also have to increase our financing. For years, the world is struggling to deliver on its commitment, the commitment of 2015 in Paris and the commitment of 2009 in Copenhagen to deliver $100 billion a year for climate finance from the north to the south, of which adaptation should be again on an equal footing. Where are we now? $20 billion short. Glasgow cannot deliver a breakthrough without countries, particularly donor governments, delivering on that commitment. And thirdly, what was agreed in our inauguration in Rotterdam, we need to forge new partnerships. One very important example, which was launched during the Climate Adaptation Summit by President Adesina of the African Development Bank and myself, was the African Adaptation Acceleration Program.
Exactly, because I was going to ask, what, in terms of concrete actions, you've talked about breakthroughs.
Yes.
Which of the initiatives from the Global Center on Adaptation are you, I guess, the most proud of?
Well, so this African Adaptation Acceleration Program, or in shorthand, AAP, is a game changer. Why? First, it's endorsed by all African heads and states and government in Africa. So it's Africa's plan on adaptation. Two, what is it? It is the largest adaptation program for Africa to date. $25 billion over 5 years for 4 areas. One, digital climate services in food security. 2, financing resilient infrastructure. 3, building, let's say, entrepreneurial spirits for the youth in Africa in a very concrete way. And 4, financing adaptation action. So where are we today? Africa has endorsed it. Of the 25 billion, half of it is already committed. We have $12.5 billion on the table, which leaves us with a shortfall of $12.5 billion.
Which is a huge amount of money.
Which is a huge amount of money. That's why we expect that in Glasgow, which is happening very soon, African leaders, G20 leaders, come together and come to terms for additional financing being put on the table in Glasgow. President Tshisekedi, president of DRC, Congo, and also the president of the African Union, is convening this sort of leaders group to have the breakthrough in Glasgow, but also look through the next COP. Glasgow is not the beginning, is not the end, it's action forcing. Next year is the COP in Africa. We need to capitalize the full 25 billion, but Glasgow needs to deliver a significant amount of that.
Okay, well, let's round up and let's look to the future. Okay, you mentioned COP26, COP27 is only just around the corner. What milestone does the Global Center on Adaptation want to achieve, let's say this time next year?
This time next year, we need to have a demonstrable material impact for those people living on the front lines. By that I mean smallholder farmers in Africa need to have their livelihoods improved. Resilient infrastructure needs to be built differently. Young entrepreneurs, again, in Africa, needs to have the opportunities to build new business through this climate adaptation lens. Additional financing needs to flow to the continent. I think these very concrete results framework, so to say, needs to be delivered, not 5 years from now, not 10 years from now, but in the next 12 months. That is success. If we don't deliver that, that is failure, which is not an option.
Very, very clear. And it sounds like you're very optimistic that it's feasible and we must make it happen.
Well, I'm not optimistic, I'm not realistic, I'm determined. And I think so should be the world.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for joining us, Mr.
My pleasure.
Patrick Verkooyen there from the Global Center on Adaptation. Now, Understanding risks is fundamental to preparing and planning for the consequences of climate change. And thankfully, we're seeing partners internationally joining forces to accelerate adaptation by sharing experiences, resources, and connecting with one another. And I'm pleased to say that our next two speakers are examples of people from organizations who are doing just that. We have from the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, the CDRI, the co-chair Kamal Kishore, who's live with us from India. You can see him on one of the speakers on our grid there. Hello, Kamal.
Hi.
And Dr. Johannes Kuhlmann, who's a director with the World Meteorological Organization, who's here to tell us about the Water and Climate Coalition. Dr. Kuhlmann, there you are. Welcome. Thank you. Let's start with you, Mr. Kishore. CDRI is developing an assessment framework that will enable countries to really build resilience by undertaking assessments of their infrastructure sectors. Can you briefly summarize what are the elements that go into that framework?
Thanks very much, Iken. I think the talk you had with Patrick just a few minutes ago is really a nice background to what I have to say. There are two sides to how we understand risk, particularly for infrastructure sectors. The first thing is that we have to recognize that infrastructure investments are not for 5 years, 10 years, they are for the long term, for multiple decades. And while we are making that investment, past is no longer a good guide for the future. So how do we assess risk, not just as it exists now, but also out into the future? I think that's the big challenge. Here in India, where the Secretariat of CDRI is based, till 10 years ago, we hardly saw any cyclones on our west coast. And now, the West Coast West Coast cyclonic activity seems to be competing with the East Coast. So we cannot base our infrastructure on the West Coast based on historical analysis of cyclonic activity there alone. So we really have to look at what are the kinds of scenarios that might be unfolding in the future and how those scenarios actually inform the kind of investments we make in infrastructure systems. The traditional methods of assessing risk based on what has happened in the past is not good enough. We really have to look into the future. It's a challenging task. It's a challenging task for developing countries. It's also a challenging task for developed countries. So I think that's one dimension. How do we look at risk not just based on what has happened, but what could happen in the future? The second thing is that we are locked into looking at infrastructure sector by sector, looking at power separate from telecom, telecom separate from water, water separate from highways, highways separate from the airports, and so on. We really have to come to a paradigm shift where we look at interconnections. You know what? When a cyclone happens and the power lines go down, when the power lines go down, after some time, telecom lines go down. When the telecom lines go down, ATM machines stop functioning. When ATM machines stop functioning, people don't have access to their cash. When people don't have access to the cash, the markets stop working. So the ripple effect across different infrastructure systems is phenomenal, So we really have to talk about, what is being termed as systemic risk, looking at interconnections across the risks. So these are the two things we really need to do in the new era of risk assessments. Look at the future risk and look at risks across sectors. Don't get locked into your comfortable silo. You really have to look at how risks ripple across the systems.
Yeah, super interesting, Mr. Kishore, especially because the two things that you've described are so really fundamentally, they require fundamental culture shifts. And they don't sound like things that a lot of people are really capable of doing, which is we're very short-term thinking, and this idea of the paradigm shift, you express it so beautifully, of understanding how sectors are linked. How receptive have people been to thinking differently in the ways that you've outlined?
There's great receptivity now. Never like in terms of awareness about the risk and awareness about what needs to happen. I think it has never been better than it is right now. CDRI is working with small island developing states. Just in 3 weeks from now, we're doing the same exercise, looking at risk out into the future for Mauritius, looking at how do we look at risk across different sectors. So it's beginning to happen. But what I must say is that, it's not just the policy end, it's also on the technical end, people who do this analytics who really have to begin to think in an interdisciplinary way. In my assessment, the demand is there. The supply really needs to step up to meet the demand. I think if I go and talk to my finance minister and say that, look, this is how we need to look at, infrastructure investment and, look at risk-adjusted returns on investments in infrastructure, look at multiple infrastructure sectors at the same time, she will say, yes, great idea. Do it for us, do the assessment for us. And then we are scrambling for, getting people from different disciplines and putting it together. So on the technical side, on the substantive side, I think supply really needs to step up. The demand is scaling very quickly. The supply needs to really catch up on that front.
Yeah. And how will the work that you're doing impact global climate adaptation, do you think?
See, the thing is this, that again, the infrastructure that the world will have by 2050, half of it is yet to be built. So if we get this right in the next 5 to 10 years, we are locking in resilience. If we don't get it right, we are locking in risk. And, there are all sorts of numbers estimating what is the level of investment going into infrastructure. They are mind-boggling numbers. $94 trillion between 2015 and 2040 is one number that one has heard. There is a huge opportunity to get it right. It's also a challenge, but it is an unparalleled opportunity that is presented to the humanity.
Yeah.
And we've done it before. Our ancestors, if you see the aqueducts in the Roman era, if you see the drainage systems in Harappan civilization in the Indian subcontinent, we are capable of thinking long term. It's a myth to say that we think only short term. We've done it in the past. We've built infrastructure in the past, which has stood the test of time for centuries. In some ways, we have to sort of rediscover that spirit in us where we think beyond our generation to multiple generations.
Yeah, thank you very much. Dr. Kuhlman, as Mr. Kishore says, we need to get it right. You're in the business at the WMO of pulling together data that is pretty harrowing, and should shock people into accelerating towards more resilient solutions. I've got one figure here that over the past 50 years, a disaster related to a weather, climate, or water hazard occurred every day on average, killing 115 people and causing over $200 million worth of losses every day. Do you find, though, that people are just numb to these numbers now, or are numbers like that accelerating a sense of urgency?
Yeah, of course, at the moment with also the COVID pandemic, people are used to terrible numbers and are a bit numb. But you can see now in the youth movements, in the youth debates, but also already a little bit in the media that goes concentrating now on COP, on the climate debate in the UN General Assembly, that people are more sensitive again for this topic. And I think it is a shocking number that so many people need to lose their lives every day. And we have seen now in Europe that it especially shocks the people when it's in their own home yard. So I think it is a little bit the problem of can I connect it? It's the same about storytelling in media. And we haven't yet totally understood how we need to relate our messages to the normal people. I think we need to do two things. We need to realize, and I think there is a nice quote from UNESCO preamble when it was created. It says, wars begin in the minds of men, and it is therefore in the minds of men that defenses of peace must be constructed. And if you translate it into modern language, you would say not men, but humans. And you would also say that the boundaries that we have at the moment to realize what we need to do are in the minds of men or of humans, and we need to overcome this. We are working on data. I have heard my fellow speaker Kamal, who is working on infrastructure. Neither the one or the other topic will save us. We need to work on having people understanding what the problem is and going beyond their normal framing reflexes. And the framing reflexes, I don't know, my country, my friends, my home, and we need to work with people so that they can go beyond the normal framing systems. Else, no investment, not 20 billion and not 100 billion will really make a change.
Yeah, I hear you. You're sort of saying we need to create communities of concern, not just not just concerned with what's going on nationally, but we're a global community, as it were. Listen, the work that you're doing, the data is super important because I guess it shows that disasters can exponentially cause a lot of loss, but opportunities can exponentially create a lot of growth and positivity and acceleration. On a personal level, are you hopeful, though?
Yeah, I am hopeful. I think now the IPCC report, we will have next year the impact reports. The COP26 will also probably not yet bring this all together, but we're working on that. We work especially also with the Dutch government on the Water and Climate Coalition, where we're trying to integrate the climate and the water topics. And I think it needs this constant bringing it back to the awareness of people that, for everybody in Germany, at least I am German, it is totally normal. Everybody knows that we do an environmental impact assessment if we procure a light bulb. But we don't do a climate or water impact assessment if we build a power plant or a dam, and this must change. And the people know it on the street, and I think I am very hopeful that through the next 2 to 3 years, also with the big conference in New York in 2023, we can really change the way that people think and the way that people are also willing to act beyond their, as I said, traditional framing.
And what's the sort of data that you would share to accompany a kind of message of hope? Like when you're trying to convince politicians that we need to invest in this stuff, what can you give us an example?
Yeah, well, an example is how much benefit you can leverage if you do, for example, joint adaptation planning, if we're talking in the water context, that's very easy. If every country within a river basin optimizes the water resource use or the hydropower generation, this will always be way below the maximum benefit that you can get if you optimize the system as a whole. So we need to understand that we live in natural systems, not that we live in national boundaries. And you can very easily quantify that those are billions of dollars across all the river basins. That's an easy economic argument. And there's also an argument about how people want to live. People don't want to live enclosed in a national boundary. They also want to go beyond. They want to be free. And we have seen that in other political contexts in the 90s. So it is also on making people understanding that they are in a river basin and not only in, the German part of the Rhine River Basin or the Dutch part of the Rhine River Basin.
Well, Henk, Dr. Kuhlmann just it says it's so easy. It's an easy economic argument to make. But why aren't governments investing in changing systems or thinking along systems lines?
Perhaps three things. One, we're replicating the past. We're in this machine of pipelines of projects that are not yet aimed at that future, that are not yet assessed by WMO's assessment. Where we try to do better, we adjust the past. No, we have to reinvent. Second, that means we have to go against vested interest across all sectors and silos we see around the world. So while there's a business case, that adds value, those values are not always financial. They're cultural, they're social, they're environmental. So third, we have to give people hope that what needs to be done, this massive change, which is systemic and fundamental, and both speakers addressed it, that can be done. And we see many examples and many instruments around the world that help us. So there's the hope, but it's still, not even a percentage. So there comes scale and replication.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you both. You're going to stay with us, I hope, for the session. But thank you both so far for your contributions. Okay, we have an overview of some of the risks associated with climate change. Let's zoom in specifically on developing and implementing adaptation plans for urban areas. And we'll do that with an expert panel, starting with Mrs. Eden Mati. Mrs. Mati is the Country Program Manager for Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor in Kenya. We also have Dr. Mark Kammerbauer, who's a director at Nexialist Agency for Research and Communication. Mrs. Nupur Proti, who is the Nature and Culture Lead on the ICOMOS Board International Council on Monuments and Sites. And Mr. Vladimir Arana, who's the Programs Manager at the International Secretariat for Water. Thank you all for joining us. Let me start with you, Mrs. Eden, or Mrs. Mati, I should say. You work to improve the lives of people who are often hardest hit by climate change, and at the same time have no or little access to safe water supply or sanitation sometimes. How should cities be innovating and protecting their residents and infrastructure? What's your view on that?
Okay, first, we see that the access to basic services is a key component of resilience. So the foundation of it all is that if people do not have access to services, then they cannot adapt. Health impacts undermine all kinds of other issues, such as keeping children out of school or stopping people from working. And we've seen this a lot across our work in various countries. Thinking in old ways will also still keep us flooded in a new climate. So we need to step out of our water and sanitation silos and also project mindsets. And I'm happy to have heard that from Kamal earlier, meaning that not only focusing on water and sanitation, but integrating a wider range of different urban development services that relate to the needs of residents. Such as drainage, solid waste management, and planned housing upgrades. So for example, if integrated urban planning is not preventing floods, then our pit latrines and water sources will get flooded and contaminated, and all the hard work that we are doing in Nairobi and in Maputo and Beira in Mozambique, for example, in bringing access to people, all that would be in vain.
Now, you put it very beautifully there. There is no adaptation without access to basic services. Let's bring in Mr. Kammerbauer, though, because in higher income countries, the basic services are there. So I'm curious, what would you say, what are the, as an urban planner, what are the climate solutions that the urban capitals of wealthy countries should be implementing? And let's perhaps focus on flooding for a moment, because that's the most.
Sure thing. Well, thank you for having me here and asking the question. It allows me to say that it is true, wealthy countries and wealthy municipalities are indeed wealthy, but not all citizens or residents are. And this is a real issue. And this is something that I researched with my colleague, Christine Bamsler from Lund University's Center for Sustainability Studies. And our study in particular of a German case shows clearly that there are also socially vulnerable people in highly developed industrial nations, although maybe not as many as in other parts of the world. What this allows us to do is, however, to compare cases, at least to very moderate degrees.
Yeah.
That also means if people are vulnerable and disaster impacts them differently than other people who may have resources, we talk about response all the time. We talk about recovery all the time. And in part, that takes out the air of the room when we want to talk about adaptation. And adaptation, of course, as all the colleagues here have said and will tell you, is highly important for urban areas across the world. There are certain issues here. Urban areas have become bigger across time. They are subject to increasing risk because of that. But there are also ways of living with these risks and accepting them and somehow adapting to them and living with floods. So there are different measures that we can undertake. There are structural measures that relate to the built environment. There are non-structural measures that relate to the things that people do, all the interesting social stuff that people are capable of. They can be gray, relating to built stuff, built matter, green, relating to nature, and blue, relating to water, which is of course also a part of nature. But there may not be enough funding available for a municipality to deal with these issues. Governments may not be capable of putting these solutions in place in the first place because they don't have the capacity to do so. Similarly with nature-based solutions, they are fantastic and they offer us a way out, but in cities that can be highly dense, you may not have the place to implement them. And you may have to deal with competing interests from other parties who may say, well, we don't want to build a retention space here. We don't want to build a park here or something that can absorb the water. So from my point of view, I think that there are measures in place that we can use, but it also requires a change in the culture of planning.
Well, that's thank you very much, and that's a perfect bridge to the next intervention I'd like us to have, and that is from Mrs. Proti. We're talking about culture, and Mr. Kishore mentioned it earlier. Mark said very clearly we need a change in the culture of planning. But how does that work in practice? Because culture is pretty ingrained and we are a stubborn species. How do you go about changing culture?
Thank you, Ken. You can call me Nupur.
Hi, Nupur.
Thank you for bringing culture in at this very critical juncture. I don't think we need to change any culture. What we need to do is we need to reconnect with our culture. All of us, when we talk about people, we're talking about risk, we're talking about adaptation. It's all coming down to different geographies. Mr. Ovink, Mark, Patrick, everyone's mentioned that there's no one solution. So when there is no one solution, we are obviously coming down to people. We're coming down to place. And then culture makes an entrance on its own. So I would say give culture a chance. I'll give you a quick example, actually. When we're talking about water, we tend to talk about, like urban flooding, we tend to focus on water. But actually, it's all about terrain. And what culture...
Can you say that one more time, just because you broke up slightly? It's not about water, okay. It's about...
landscape. It's about the terrain. It's about land. And the moment we understand land, which is what in the past it was understood, that where did we construct, how did we construct, where did we capture water? So the moment we understand where we are in place, how culturally we led, how we understood the water system, water management. I mean, there's so many examples. I'll take a very quick example from India, the temple tanks of Bhubaneswar, where there are temples built around the tank because it was so sacred, they could only survive if water. As flooding increases, what should we do? We should take care of the tank. But you see, in the past, they were far more intelligent and they were using their common sense far more because they were not only protecting the tank, they had temples built along the channels of water that were feeding the tank, which meant it was a clear message to the people. Please protect the channels, not just the tank. So we really, the culture is in us. We just have to go back to it and we have to get people reconnected to it.
Good grief. So the answers are there. How did we lose our way?
I would call it the grand disruption. And it's a topic for a much larger, time and audience. But it's basically that we've taught people that science and technology is more important than their own understanding of their context, their traditions, their culture, and their connect with nature. So I think it's the last 200 years, not very long. It's just 200 years of what I would call the grand disruption.
Okay. Well, Mr. Ovink, Henk, you were nodding away vigorously there.
Yeah, what Nupur was explaining is really reference also a program we set up in the world where we use water as a leverage, as a springboard. And one of the initiatives is in Chennai, in India, where we indeed very much look back in time at the history. How was this city built along there? How these water places became sacred places, temple tanks, and we're now restoring those tanks, but also building more and new as a social, but also as an economic endeavor. The community does it, they own it, and now we can scale it up. So, better health, they mitigate risks of flooding, the water quality is improved, the water goes back into the aquifer where it was lost before. So you see, that inspiration comes from the past. At the same time, we bring the current culture and the future needs to that same replication, and it's almost like a reinventing the past for a better future. And I think that connection to those values, those cultural values, are of great inspirations. It's not enough, it's a start. We need scale, we are in a different time now, but there's a lot of inspiration and lessons to be learned on how we dealt with nature and our systems. And then second to Mr. Kammerbauer on the nature-based solutions, there's a great connection with what Nupur tells. Nature-based solutions on that scale of the community do work if you work with that community.
Yeah.
They again help mitigate the risks, they bring the water back to the aquifer, they help clean it, they help mitigate and offset carbon, and they're cheaper. There is a business case. It saves us in Chennai in investment a third of the cost. It decreases carbon footprint because we don't need desalination plants and trucking of water anymore. And in maintenance and operations, by ownership of those communities, it saves us half. So there is real opportunity to do better by culture and nature.
Yeah, it really sounds like a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Let's bring in Vladimir here. Vladimir, what do you think local urban areas should be prioritizing when it comes to adaptation solutions?
Thank you, Ikena, and thank you also to the Dutch government and the Global Center on Adaptation. There are many things, in my opinion, that we need to implement. And many of those things begin from the way that we are interpreting things, that we are understanding things. And urban planning and cities development in developing countries are clearly not ready yet to implement fully adaptation programs. But the thing is that disasters will continue. So either we have to prepare in a better way for those disasters, and that implies that governments need to associate with other governments and think of a regional response when disasters appear, because in many cases, disasters overcome the capacity of national governments. But on the other side, on the prevention side, we need to strengthen planning. While in developed countries, industrialized countries, planning is an extended concept, and there are many professionals dedicated to that. In developing countries, the situation is not the same. What happens is that even though the government officers are making a great job, the social and environmental demands are too much, are too high. And developing countries don't have the capacity to face these demands. So what we need is to restructure a little bit the state and prepare better for these prevention things. What happens in developing countries, for instance, is that less than 20% of cities have their plans or urban plans ready, and happens in all the developing world in one side. On the other side, people and citizens and youth, for instance, that have a very flexible capacity to interact, they have no idea what their plans are about when they are ready. And on the other hand, we have this demand. We're talking a lot about accelerating adaptation, but here we find a little constraint, because most of the adaptation programs are implemented through central governments, and central government have a very slow capacity to make projects. And for instance, when they want to make a project, they begin the design and then approve the budget and everything. 3 or 4 years, or perhaps 5 years, may take place in developing countries. So we need to make these resources available in a more direct way, straight to the citizens, straight to organized citizens to youth, for instance. There are many organizations in the world. And
so you're also talking about, we need to shift our focus. Yeah.
Yeah, and democratize these instruments. In many places, we believe that the poor don't have the capacity to make their own planning. And I would say that is wrong. Poor people and vulnerable people have a very strong capacity to understand these issues and to begin making also their own planning and also implementing adaptation projects. So many of these things could be resources and knowledge could be shared in a more horizontal way, so we can accelerate adaptation in urban areas too.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Vladimir. And you bring up a point which is very timely, because I'd like to talk about adaptation in a development context, and I'll be doing that with our new speaker. Joining me via virtually, there he is, Dr. Patrick Moriarty, Director of IRC, a think and do tank on water, sanitation and hygiene. Thanks for joining us, Patrick. Listen, to switch it up, I'm going to make it a little bit harder for you. I'd like to provide you with a provocative statement, okay? And give us your thoughts on that. The statement is, adaptation is going far too slowly because we first need to reach a certain level of development before we can really start adapting.
Thanks, Ikenna. Yes, no, very provocative and absolute. Well, so yes and no. Adaptation's going far too slowly. That's absolutely right. But the idea that there's some sort of competition between adaptation and development is completely wrong. It's not even wrong. Looking at water and sanitation, and I think you heard Eden already talk about it. If we're talking about adaptation and we're talking about resilience, we're talking about the resilience of the fundamental and basic public services that people rely on, whether that's electricity, whether that's water and sanitation, whether that's sewerage, right? And that's as true in the wealthy world as it is in the poorer world. Look at New Orleans. And when you have your power knocked out for 5 days, you've got sewage in the street, you don't have fresh water, it turns a disaster into a catastrophe, right? But the developmental angle, we don't have it. The idea that we have a competition between, should we invest in water and sanitation or should we invest in adaptation? It completely misses the point about what it is we're talking about. Who is it who delivers water and sanitation services? It's engineers, it's planners, it's all the people we've just been hearing about from the other colleagues. Building their capacity, the ability of that system, the system that delivers in water and sanitation, it's a critical part of the system that we need to have in place to adapt, right? So yes, we have to reach out more. Yes, we have to break out of our silos. But if we're not prepared to invest in development as part of adaptation, we're completely missing the point.
But is this a chicken and egg scenario? I mean, you need some focus. You need to be able to prioritize in some way or form, don't you? So, or am I seeing that incorrectly?
I think to some extent you're seeing it incorrectly. You have to bring adaptation and resilience into these critical services. And I think it's not just me saying it. I think we've heard it from several of the other folks talking today. We have to make our water and sanitation services able to adapt and use our water and sanitation services to make us more resilient.
And let's say, are funders receptive to this, to the idea that we need to, the two are just inextricably linked?
No, sadly not.
Oh,
and I think,
the laugh says it all.
on the one hand, the question's maybe not even wrong. In my world, unfortunately, the question's been asked all the time because you get exactly this sort of reasoning. Oh, but if we invest in adaptive capacity, we're not going to be able to invest in the hardware to do the pipes and the pumps and the sewage networks, right? But as I think it was Kamal was saying, these are investments that of their nature are multi-generational. I mean, they're generational, 20 years, 30 years. So if you don't address adaptation now, When are you going to address it?
Yeah, very clear. Henk, did you want to reflect?
No, this is totally agree. If we mainstream adaptation across everything we do, that is of critical importance. Otherwise, everything we put in place in our infrastructure and investments will fail tomorrow. So if we don't make every investment more resilient, we fail. Second, so that's a prevention of loss. But second, if we do this more resilient, if adaptation is mainstreamed and every dollar, euro, yen we put in place, there's an added value. And that's what we've been talking about too, in culture, in environment, in biodiversity, and in our social context of communities and the most vulnerable perhaps even first. So mainstreaming adaptation adds value across and it's a no-brainer, but as said, it's not easy because it means a shift in how we invest, away from how we did it yesterday and today, towards a model of mainstreaming adaptation in the investments for tomorrow.
A more sophisticated way of looking at things.
Yeah,
really.
It's more sophisticated. At the same time, it's also, as said, a no-brainer. It's so straightforward.
Exactly.
If you want your investments not to go to waste, you have to adapt. Every insurer and insurance around the world help us understand this. Really say, hey, if you don't take into account future losses and risks into the investments you put in place now, you fail. And this is...
So why aren't governments following the examples or advice of these big successful insurers, for instance?
Well, we are, and this is also where we started this year at the Climate Adaptation Summit with good examples next to this call to action. But if you add it up in the dollars of investment, it's not enough. So because everything we thought about yesterday is now being put in place. So rethinking and that mind, cultural and system shift on how we invest is happening now. So we don't see the results. Putting infrastructure on the ground takes time. We don't have that time. We really feel that urgency and that need to act. Adaptation helps us not only to be smarter, more resilient and more sustainable, also helps us to be more inclusive, bringing all these silos, organized, institutionalized, but also informal to the table to ensure that we understand it comprehensively and inclusive, and look at that future. So it's happening, but the results of that and this rippling effect of what we put in place is still to be shown.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on from development plans or developing plans to tackle the consequences of climate change towards implementation. And first of all, I'd like to share a video from Dr. Hengyi Li of the Beijing Institute of Water, and he'll tell us more about the development implementation of adaptation in Beijing.
Climate change will amplify existing risks and create new risks for natural and human systems, especially for megacities. The challenges of understanding and managing uncertainties are very important for us. The water-related uncertainties from climate change impacts are probably the most critical part right now. Beijing is drafting a new plan aiming to build a more resilient city with ecological restoration. A number of green action initiatives will be launched, covering wide-ranging efforts in green infrastructure, green education, and green cooperation to bring more benefits to the people of our city. We will spend about 15 years to become livable capital, which will be able to withstand the forces of climate change. Sustainable development is what people of all countries long for, and it is also the responsibility of our generation to adapt the climate conditions. We are willing to enhance alignment in development strategies with partners, such as GCA, scale up ecological cooperation, to build a community with a shared future in adaptive management of climate change. GCA has demonstrated a high level of professionalism and dedication, and we are deeply grateful for their efforts. We are expecting the more efficient and effective cooperation in the near future, and developing valuable adaptive measures to benefit mankind. Let's move together. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to Dr. Li there. Okay, let's go back to the panel. I'd like to talk to, Eden. Tell me, in a Kenyan context or in a regional context, what are the most common challenges you face when it comes to implementing adaptation plans?
First, I'd just like to reiterate what has been said by Moriarty and other speakers as regards lack of capacity to mainstream climate adaptation into development projects. We see that so often also in the work that we are doing across our cities as WhatsApp. And I really want to underscore that would be one of the main challenges that we are facing. There's obviously the challenge of silos that has been mentioned again, not really adapting while working in an integrated environment. First of all, seeking out who are the main institutions and duty bearers in terms of, say, providing water and sanitation services, and mainstreaming and anchoring climate adaptation through all these diverse players who are delivering various services such as whether it's housing, upgrades, dealing with drainage, solid waste management, and also water and sanitation. I think one other thing that comes to mind is lack, or in the context of Kenya and Africa more widely, is data, monitoring data, information, how accessible is that information and knowledge by our key planners, people who are leading urban development work in adapting climate resilience. I think for me, those would be the key challenges that we face in trying to scale up some of the initiatives that we are already implementing at a smaller scale.
Yeah. Thanks very much. Henk, I mean, I hear the same challenges being talked about in relation to lots of different regions of the world. Lack of capacity, silo thinking, insufficient data sharing. Is anybody getting it right?
Yeah, there are luckily, as said, many good examples and also many programs that help. AGWA, together with the UNFCCC and with support of donor countries like the Netherlands and the UK, is setting up an adaptation academy. Hundreds and hundreds of people around the world are already joining this academy we just launched, really to understand how to get adaptation right in policy, projects, validation mechanisms, and so forth. WaterAid is working on a water accelerator to really help countries look across policymakers, investors, but also operators, looking across the full water cycle. And together with the Global Water Partnership, again, AGWA is introducing at the COP a water tracker. So an instrument that helps countries better perform on water as a productive factor in their adaptation and mitigation strategies. So we have many initiatives around the world that really help build capacity, understanding across silos, help enforce governance.
But these are initiatives, and I'd expect these to be good because they come from people who know what they're doing. But when it comes to convincing local governments, who's the most receptive? We can call them out, and who's the least receptive to this kind of to this the culture shift that we need and the
If you look around the world and you look very local in the communities, perhaps the communities that are most at risk, the receptiveness is highest. There is even a massive amount of capacity there.
Yeah.
And I heard many speakers already said that, but we don't tap into that capacity enough. From an institutional, often too global or abstract level, that connection between global and local is sometimes lacking. So I think one is be empowered and encouraged by the most marginalized, the indigenous, the local communities that really understand risk. They understand risk and they live with it, but they also need a partnership approach from across the world to help those interventions bring to scale and become not only resilient, but also sustainable across time. Yeah. So I think there on receptiveness, there is a huge amount of inspiration there.
Okay. Nupur, you heard it there. The communities most at risk are often the most receptive. When it comes to getting local ownership of adaptation initiatives among communities which aren't at risk and do need convincing, how should we go about doing that?
So I always find that, the culture that, or the organization that I represent, we have a very unique background because we are scientists, social scientists, we're doing work with people. So one of the ways, I'll just give a quick example, and I'll give the example of the same place in Bhubaneswar. So one of the ways of actually bringing people together on the same platform was very often we engage governments in their locations, in their offices, and we bring people into their offices for the stakeholder workshops. And this time we decided to change that. We brought the government to brought the government to the temple tank. And I tell you, the engagement at that point of the local people, the priests, the councillors, that is the municipal representatives, it was something else because what you were telling them, they were seeing. So the background we come from, because we are people, we are into physical planning, we are into actually planning for heritage, planning for the environment physically. We translate what we say to the ground. So as a result, what happens is you can actually make people visualize that if you're doing this, this is where you're going to land up. And the moment you change your action, obviously the destination is going to be something else. So I think it's not so difficult. I think we are working and reinventing our ways.
Yeah. And Mark, in your experience, what's going particularly well when it comes to implementing adaptation plans?
Well, originally, when we started to get together and discuss the things we wanted to talk about, one question was, do you know good examples? And in my view, the best examples are yet to come because in my heart of hearts, I'm a designer. I have to admit that. And as a designer, you're perpetually unhappy with the state of things. Oh. At the same time, that's a great incentive to research what is going on. And in fact, there are things that I really enjoy. And Patrick also mentioned in New Orleans. And for instance, I really like the work that Wagoner and Ball are doing in New Orleans. And this is the point where we would have to talk about particular examples and such, and the particular measures that are in place. But in general, I do think, and as insight from the research that I've been doing with my partners in Australia and Sweden and so forth, there are many ways of how to approach adaptation. You can have different planning goals. Let's say you want to build a resilient city. You want to have sustainability in wherever you live. You can even have both. Adaptation measures can be similar across the board. You can have levees, you can have dikes, you can have retention areas, and the likelihood is you can't do without. But from my point of view, all of these work best if you have the social factor included, if you have inclusion, if you have sustainable planning practices where you bring people in, where you bring the vulnerable people in, where you have everybody sit at the table, everybody is aware of the problems they are, and you can somehow mitigate or ameliorate or reduce the planning conflicts that may exist. If whatever you do and whatever any city across the world does, we all know that the context matters very, very much. If you have that, you can achieve something great and sustainable and resilient for all the people who live there, not only for a particular group of people.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you. Okay, we've identified the risks and we talked about planning for adaptations and implementing these plans. The question now is, how do we scale once we have them? And joining us, we have Kathleen Dominique, who's the program lead for financing water at the OECD. Thank you very much for joining us, Kathleen. Kathleen, what do you make of all the solutions and insights that we've heard today? Are they fundable?
Well, indeed. I mean, this is the big question, right? Obviously, the question of finance and how you bring all of these community-led projects to scale is, at the heart of this question of making adaptation happen. We like to think about the financing question in two dimensions. One is thinking about the how much, but also about the how. And the how much is oftentimes when we talk about financing, we're talking about this massive gap in terms of investment needs. And we've heard some figures quoted in this discussion. There are many different studies out there that try to estimate total needs for adaptation over many decades, and this is difficult to do. But we know that the scale of the needs is massive. We also know that the financing that's going toward adaptation is still a small share of total climate finance. So I just want to make that point. I think that's important to recognize. OECD actually released a report last week on tracking climate finance, and this is the finance that is mobilized by developed countries for developing countries. That's against the $100 billion goal that has already been mentioned earlier. And in fact, what we see is that in terms of the latest figures, only about $1 in $4 of climate finance goes for adaptation. Okay, so that's up a little bit from the previous year where there was about 21% of climate finance going for adaptation, but the large majority is still for mitigation. So the trend is inching towards adaptation, but we know that there's simply not enough funding flowing for adaptation. So that's really key, and that's all about the how much, if you will.
Yeah.
But I think equally important is thinking about the how of the financing and where you make investments and how you make investments. And so in our own work, we look very closely at also ways to improve the effectiveness of existing financing flows or the effectiveness of managing existing assets and making them more resilient for the future. And I think that connects very much with many of the comments that have already been made, these great points around thinking over multi-decade timeframes, over planning infrastructure and building infrastructure that is adapted for a future that's going to be very different from the past. And so that's using the finance that we do have in a more strategic and catalytic way. And that's to make sure that we're building things that are going to be resilient in a changing climate, that we're also shifting finance away from projects and investments that are going to be maladapted to the future climate, and also looking to use existing finance to crowd in other forms of capital. So being creative about those solutions, using the limited public money we have or development finance we have to crowd in a broader range of sources of capital. So those are two dimensions that we think are quite important, and I think resonate with some of the points that were already raised.
Definitely, but specifically in relation to the point Patrick made about the need to see them as inextricably linked, adaptation and development, and he laughed when I said, defund us, and you're already nodding. Why are they incapable of seeing the two as linked, and what's necessary to change their mindset?
Well, I think one thing that's very positive, and also that we've heard from many others, is that making the economic case in terms of benefits being greater than the costs of adapting early and adapting in a smart way, there's a lot of evidence for that. And there are a lot of governments and local actors and communities who are acting on that. But when it comes to finance, it doesn't always translate into an easy financing case. So you can have a very good economic case for over time, these benefits are going to emerge, but it doesn't mean that's going to be attractive to financiers and that's going to give financial benefits right away. So that's a very different question. And I know in our work, also in others who are working in this area, it's really about adapting the financing models, looking for new sources of capital, looking for creative ways to adapt proven financing models, but also being creative about innovative financing models and thinking about, the systems of adaptation that we have. When we think about water, how do we connect that to biodiversity? How do we connect that to infrastructure services, et cetera? And that can make a more compelling financial case.
And can you give one example of a creative financial financing which took into consideration different capital and money flows?
Absolutely. So, I mean, one thing we do at the OECD, but also in partnership with the Dutch government and the World Bank and the World Water Council, is we established a dedicated forum to talk about these questions. It's called the Roundtable on Financing Water. And actually, the next 2 days, we have a dedicated meeting focused on how financing water can contribute to climate action. And we'll hear a lot of different examples there, but I think one that comes to mind now that I think is very interesting is this notion of forest resilience bonds. So this is using a capital market instrument to raise funds for improving the resilience of watersheds and the resilience of forests that can also provide some benefits in terms of adapting to climate change by reducing the impacts of wildfire. And you have all these other co-benefits to this type of funding strategy. You get benefits for biodiversity, you get benefits for water quality, you get benefits for water management. And so I think those are the types of products we see emerging in different contexts. And of course, as others have said, this is a very context-specific challenge and problem. But this is really where I think we also see people being very creative to see how these types of financing approaches can be adapted to diverse contexts.
Thank you very much. I do get worried that you're asking NGOs need to start hiring very financial whiz kids to come up with convincing financing packages for their submissions for funding. But anyway, that's something else. Let me bring in Patrick. Patrick, when IRC is involved in building an investment pipeline for adaptation projects, let's say, are the challenges different when it comes to scaling up between developed countries and developing countries?
Wow, yes, I think so, and I think that it goes to the point you've just been making. And look, I think as people like us, I look at myself, people with a technocratic background are prone to do. We sit here and we talk about what's possible. We talk about that it's easy. We talk about that the solution, and it is, like conceptually it's easy, right? We need to come out of our silos. We need to talk to each other more. But then I begin to think about the local governments that I work with. I look, the resource constraints they operate under. And yeah, it's fine to tell them to come out of their silo, but frankly, half the time they maybe don't even have fuel for a vehicle to get out of their silo with. So it's easy for someone like me to talk about that, and it's easy for us to put those forward. And I think that there is a big difference, and we all need to be aware of that, between what's possible within middle income and rich country settings and what's necessary in the poorest of the poor. And when yesterday or the day before, I think President Biden announced, which is great, that they're doubling aid for adaptation, 11 billion a year. But the US is putting 120 billion a month into quantitative easing. Okay. And the US is debating $1 trillion, $2 trillion, $3 billion infrastructure investment deal for the US, with 320 million people, and we're talking about now we're bringing it up to 11 billion a year for the poorest countries. Africa over 1 billion people. So there's something wrong here. There's something wrong about equity. There's something wrong, and I think we just can't let that go. The countries that have caused the problem, the rich countries who've created the global climate crisis, do have a duty, I think, to the poorest countries. And I'm very sympathetic to what Kathleen and the OECD work on doing, the blending, the trying to bring in private money. But the reality is for the poorest countries of the world, the poorest cities of the world, there's not a blending deal to be done. We just need to accept that if we want to help them to scale adaptation, we have to pay for it. And by we, I mean the rich world.
Yeah. Well, some people are stepping up to the plate and paying. Eden, give us an example. Who's financing the projects that you're working on at the moment?
Just wanted to make a comment on what Patrick has said, and very interesting statistics before I come to your question. Just one other challenge we are having as African countries is having very clear goals and objectives on what exactly is meant by adapting, especially to flood resilience. So do our service providers, our regulators, our ministries and other, local governments have clarity of mind on what their needs are and what the wash sector and other sectors need to do to adapt to climate change resilience? So I think that's a starting point, because even as organizations with that clarity and a goal in mind, becomes much more easier to have those linkages with financing. As WASAP, we work mainly through mandated institutions and mainly through leverage. Currently, we are influence budgeting processes in public institutions and utilities, so their annual fiscal budgets, and we let them drive this work. For example, at a lower scale, because we are not yet at a place where we can say we have scaled, we do get specific funding from donors to mainstream and to anchor climate adaptation and flood resilience into our work. And in Nairobi, for example, we are implementing an integrated slum upgrading program. In Nairobi, our specific focus with the utility is on the sanitation component. However, we've worked across all the consortium members and all the different sectoral partners from the Nairobi Metropolitan Services, and together with the utility, for everyone to bring in and leverage their funding into the project.
Okay.
So we hope that this will be quite an interesting case in point for future initiatives. So allow me just to mention one more project we have upcoming.
Very quickly.
All right. Yeah, just basically the same, working with the county governments at the coast in Mombasa and Malindi, together with the respective departments at the county government and the utilities, and leveraging on their budgets and also ours to plan together for implementation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to bring in Vladimir. Vladimir, do you, reflecting on the conversations that we've had about financing, what are your thoughts?
Well, I believe that we need many reforms from mainly the national governments in developing countries. We need more resources, that's true, but we need a better way to allocate those resources where the problems are taking place. And there are many weaknesses. One weakness, for instance, is the fact that public sector is not executing their budget completely. So they need, sometimes local governments need to give the money back to the central government, and then the resources are not used like for 1 or 2 years. We need to make those resources to go to into a better mechanism, so the resources may not be lost or may not be delayed in their spending. So that's one thing about financing. And another important aspect that I consider there's a key issue is to develop private-public partnerships, but with communities. So communities can invest with the government, with the state, and with private sector or banking or microcredit organizations, so they can afford also their projects, even with private money. Of course, it would be easier if the money comes from the public sector or the money that you don't have to pay back. But in many cases, the necessities are so urgent that they need to put their hands to work right away. And these need to be incorporated with planning mechanisms, because planning is mostly made from the public sector and hasn't landed into the people. So people need to have those tools to make planning and spend their money. And the question is like, who's going to do that? So the approach that we have is that, of course, citizens can do it. There are many cases, the validated cases, where people can do it, but also there are youth organizations. There are more than 3,000 youth organizations in the world working in water issues, on conservation issues. Around 40% of them are exclusively dedicated to water issues, and they're organized, they implement projects, And I see that there's a big potential investing in youth to work and implement adaptation faster, to spend the money in a more efficient way, and to have a direct impact in a broader way. So using these mechanisms, we are not only sharing knowledge, we're sharing resources, but at the same time, we're scaling up this through citizens, through youth, through people. That could be a very interesting approach.
Yeah, no. I had to cut you off there, but I really appreciate your focus in this time and in your previous comment on as it were, the underused resource of local communities and the youth, grassroots organizations. So thank you very much, Vladimir. And on that note, thank you very much also to all of our speakers for all of your contributions. I think we've talked a lot about understanding risks, implementation and scaling. So we're going to now move on to looking forward. I hope you continue watching, but I will say goodbye for now. Thank you very much. The way forward. Before we do that, I'd like to run a couple of videos. The first is from Hakima El Haite, who is a change maker in the adaptation domain. She has a long diplomatic career driving adaptation forward, and she provided us with her vision on driving adaptation action forward.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, greeting from Morocco. I would like first to congratulate the government of Netherlands for its historical and amazing policy on water management. And I would like also to thank the Global Center on Adaptation for putting the adaptation in the heart of the discussions and actions to tackle the effect of climate change. During many years, during the negotiation, parties to the UNFCCC acknowledge adaptation as a key component of the long-term global response to climate change to protect people, livelihoods, and ecosystems. The parties recognize, and it's a great achievement, that adaptation is a global challenge faced by all and have decided to give adaptation the same importance than mitigation. We use that time to hear within the arena of negotiation, the more we mitigate, the less we need to adapt. Today, it's rather the more we adapt and mitigate in the same time, the more we have a chance to survive in dignity in many areas in the world. Adaptation is not anymore the issue of developing world. In any corner of this planet, people are facing climate change with sometimes very heavy bills, their lives. Therefore, adaptation to climate change should be in the heart of the global transformation called for by the Paris Agreement. Adaptation should be in the heart of the indices. It's only by combining adaptation with CO2 emission reduction that we can stimulate the economic transformation needed to achieve the SDGs goals and to implement the Paris Agreement. We need to go toward a development that is climate resistant and resilient, carbon neutral, fills energy, water, and food deficit, stimulates growth, and consequently reduce poverty. By 2050, climate change will likely impact millions, if not billions of people if we don't act now and if we don't adapt now. It's time to change the current levels of vulnerability and to elaborate a multidisciplinary roadmap for vulnerable sectors and subsectors. We need to act globally, nationally, and locally. In fact, we need a New Deal for adaptation, which is a kind of an integrated and a concerted roadmap for dealing with adaptation, technically through capacity building and technology transfer, financially Financial allocations for adaptation must be integrated, clarified, simplified, accessible, and coherent. And here, I will begin by first saying that party should deliver on the financial promises of the Paris Agreement, and that the pandemic should not be used or should not be the reason to postpone their support, financial support, but the opportunity for more solidarity, more international cooperation to build better, greener, to be able to adapt ourselves. We need a national, regional, and international coordination schema led by governments with the contribution of national and international institutions is needed to address adaptation. Concerted global climate action is crucial. And within this action, adaptation is a key issue. With so many human beings living on the edge of the poverty line, climate change could reverse much of the development progress already made. To combat this effect and this negative effect, vulnerable countries must constantly adapt. However, if this constant effort is a constraint, the road which opened today for a more sustainable development, a more low-carbon world presents an opportunity to achieve the economic transformation called for by the Paris Agreement. I hope that parties will enhance their ambitions during COP26 to allow us to go toward a low-carbon future. I hope also that tools and mechanisms to put price on a carbon will be delivered, and that part of this money will be used to close the existing gap to finance adaptation. Finally, I will say that all about climate change is change. Change is often difficult and may face resistance, but it's time to understand that we cannot negotiate with nature. And it's only with innovative, nature-based solutions that we will win the challenge of climate change together. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Hakima El Haite there for her insights. We have heard insights from experts based all over the world today, Henk.
Yeah.
We're looking towards the future. What do you think needs to be in place for this positive, optimistic future that we all want?
I think we heard many great examples that are inspiring, but also many challenges to overcome the current lock-in we often see in single-focused infrastructure, mechanisms that actually make that profitable and go to more value-based, system-based, or river basin or urban-based approach, where the community, the most marginalized perhaps first, plays a critical role. And to support that, to support our capacity building, to support that understanding, to support action, we need a roadmap. We have stepping stones. First is COP26 in Glasgow, next COP next year, and then in 2023, for the first time since 1977, for the second time in the history of the United Nations, we'll have a global water summit. Mm-hmm. The Netherlands is honored to co-chair that summit together with Tajikistan. We work very hard to turn these stepping stones into a roadmap that really supports understanding, commitments, and actions.
Very clear. Thank you very much. So lots to look forward to. A lot of work has to be done, but it must get done, and it will get done. For now, we're drawing a close to this session. Before we do, though, some news. The Water Adaptation Community, the WAC, is a digital platform that allows its users to collaborate, connect with one another, and share knowledge and resources. And it's launching a community of practice to continue the discussions on urban resilience. So we'd love you to please register and become a member of that lively community. That's exactly what I'm going to do as soon as we finish this show. So please do the same. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. All the best.